Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to take a few more minutes to let others get in, and then we're going to get started.
Well, good afternoon. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to our 25th webinar in the Coffee With series sponsored by the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership at Seton Hall University. I'm Reggie Lewis, Executive Director of the Greenleaf Center, and it's great to greet all of you who've logged on today from places around the U.S. and abroad to take part in our conversation with the Paula DiPerna, a leading voice on the environment and sustainable development and author of Pricing the Priceless. Today's webinar helps the center to mark its celebration of Earth Day, a time to remind all who practice servant leadership of the critical importance of environmental stewardship and preserving our priceless planet. The Coffee With series provides the center the chance to showcase the inspirational stories of servant leaders and the endless ways in which individuals, organizations, and society in general can be transformed by the power of servant leadership, a philosophy in which the leader first seeks to serve. And I assure you, today's guest will not disappoint. In a few minutes, we will, of course, formally introduce our guest, but before we proceed any further, a quick word about the Center for Servant Leadership. For nearly 60 years, the Greenleaf Center has worked to promote the awareness, understanding, and practice of servant leadership. In addition to the Coffee With series, other core programs include the annual Public Policy Lecture, which features thought leaders and issue experts from a range of sectors who apply a servant leader's perspective to current policy challenges. The Greenleaf Scholars, which funds researchers whose work promotes the efficacy and impact of servant leadership. The center also exposes high school and college students to opportunities to develop lives of service through our Next Generation initiative. And through our outside engagements, we proudly work closely with organizational partners as they implement the practice of servant leadership throughout their workplace culture. And now the moment we've all been waiting for. It is indeed my honor to formally introduce today's guest, but really to welcome her back since Paula has been with us before. Paula DiPerna is Special Advisor to CDP North America, where she's a pioneer of strategic global environmental and philanthropic policy and a widely published author and commentator on contemporary issues. Paula also serves on the board of advisors of Global Kids, the circle of advisors of Rachel's Network, and the board of directors of one of my favorites, the History Makers. As a leader in the development of carbon markets, and you're going to hear about that soon, Paula served as president of the international division of the Chicago Climate Exchange. She's also the former president of the Joyce Foundation and major U.S. philanthropy, and she was a writer, co-producer, and vice president for international affairs for the Cousteau Society. In 2023, Paula released Pricing the Priceless, the financial transformation to value the planet, solve the climate crisis, and protect our most precious assets. And we are so fortunate to have her here today, back on our webinar series. Paula, are you ready? Have you got your mug?
I've got my mug. It doesn't have much coffee in it, but I'm going to try to drink the dregs. But good to be back with you, Reggie, and your audience.
Excellent. Excellent. But before we jump in, obviously today is Earth Day, and clearly those of us in New Jersey are paying a little bit more attention about our planet after our experience with the third largest earthquake most recently. So clearly climate change is something that matters. And so what a timely discussion to have, and a treat to have you lead us off on that on today. But before we jump in, as those of us who've joined, we always begin with our guests and learning a bit more about what we call the formative years. And Paula, we understand from a little bit of our research that you grew up in the great city of New York, and that there's something that you used to do back in the day, as they say, that perhaps one might not do today. Do you mind sharing that with our audience?
Sure. I mean, growing up in New York City and in proximity of New Jersey and the Jersey Shore and all of that was, very critical to most of what I did after that. But one of the things I always wanted to do was have my own money. And so I got this job working in Manhattan while I was still in high school. As soon as you could legally work, I got my work permit, and I got this job in the toy department down on East 46th Street, and had to take the subway down there after school. And so, I'd be exhausted from school, but even more exhausted going home. So you just kind of crossed your arms and had your book bag on your lap, and I just fell asleep. And there was always an alarm that said, okay, you're stopped soon, Grand Central. And never missed a stop, but I always had a good nap. And of course, you wouldn't do it today, mostly out of fear. But it just reminds me how important it is to have maintenance of a system. At the time, it wasn't only that we were less fearful of each other, and there were less challenges, but the subway was sparkling clean. There was a human being in every car. So sleeping on the subway was kind of no big deal. But I haven't slept lately on the subway, to be honest. Excuse me.
And then in considering your childhood and friends and early schooling and all that, anything jumps out at you with respect to triggers, with respect to interests around the environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to, especially on something like Earth Day, to recognize that tree hugging, to put it mildly, is only one aspect of it. And I certainly, excuse me, there was nothing in my background that would have suggested that I'd ever be, talking about the things I've been talking about. And one of the things that I remember vividly was, well, there are two things. My Aunt Rose used to take me to her bungalow every weekend or every other weekend. And on Friday night, we'd walk around the garden, and she would always say, let's see what's going on. Like as if it was a stage play, this bird, that leaf, this, that. And I learned then that peat moss wasn't a person, that, peat moss was not a neighbor. But the other thing was we lived, for us, the public park, there was no park near our house. It was a highway called the Henry Hutchison Parkway. And one day there was a fire down there, on the grass, and that was like our lawn. And so one of our talk about leadership, there was a friend of mine named Richard Cianci, who was in the end a theater director, and he just said, the fire is burning, everything's burning. So we go running down to the Henry Hudson Parkway and start trying to restore the grass. Now, we knew nothing about grass, and the fire had been put out by the fire department, but still we were like scraping grass from a new place, put it in the old place, put it down. And it was a rescue operation. And I realize now in retrospect, there was something innate in us, something innate that this was, we were responsible for this patch of grass, and we didn't know anything about what we're doing, but at least we tried something.
You try something and you literally put together some homemade sod. That's pretty impressive.
Needed sod, you got to make it. And, that's kind of where we are in the world. We need so many things, we've got to make them.
Absolutely. So we were to shift now in terms of career milestone, and you've got plenty. You early in your career, you taught in the New York City public schools, but in talking to us about what led you to education, can you also say a bit about the earliest career aspirations that you had?
Well, originally I wanted to be an academic, university professor, and comparative literature and the life of the mind, if you will. And so, I studied English in college, and then, teaching was always a handy fallback, especially if you were a woman. And I applied for doctoral fellowship, which I didn't get. It came down to 2 people. I didn't get it. And so I thought, well, I'll teach for a while and see how that goes. And so I love teaching. I still love teaching. But I was one of the victims of the layoffs in New York City when the city was under a severe budget crisis. And they just knocked out a whole generation of teachers. And possibly maybe that's one of the reasons New York City fell into a certain kind of chaos around teaching and local community control and so on. But that, the point, I guess, of all of this is underlying it all. I always wanted to be a writer. That was my goal. And all this other, there was always a writing component. And in fact, the first article I ever was paid for which I received $150, was about being laid off in that high school. And so, that started my freelance writing career. And I did for a number of years cover the New York City schools for a publication at that time called The Village Voice. Still very far from environment, had nothing to do with environment at that time.
But you would eventually on your journey land an enormous opportunity with the internationally recognized French ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau. And I promise a few of the young people in my office and some on the campus that I would give a thorough explanation or a brief one about Jacques Cousteau, since that predates some of my young colleagues here. But I still recall watching my parents, black and white, with a couple of siblings who would fight with me about access to the channels. The National Geographic series about Jacques Cousteau, who was a scientist, filmmaker, ocean explorer, concerned with ocean research, but also environmental protection more broadly, particularly as it relates to the vast seas and waterways. What was it like to work with this environmental icon, and exactly what did you do with it?
Right. Well, again, just back to what I said about if you need something, you have to make it. The key thing for people to know, may not know today, is that Cousteau was the co-inventor of the scuba device, the breathing apparatus. Before that, there was you could go down underwater with a very cumbersome suit and a tube like that, but you could only be down there as long as you could hold your breath. And so he, after the Second World War, he worked with this other French engineer who was working on a stove so that the gas that fed the stove for cooking didn't come back into the kitchen. We all know you can't breathe gas. So together they worked on this valve, and Cousteau realized it could be adapted to be for the underwater breathing apparatus that many of your students probably do know, or probably divers. So there again, you have an engineering innovation applied to the mind of someone who is essentially a innovator and a creative person who already knew the beauty of the underwater world around the south of France, but only as a snorkeler or as a free diver, skin diver. So now, once you could go underwater for a longer period of time, I mean, he invented the tanks, invented the tubes, invented the whole thing, started a company called US Divers. And so once these guys were, and they were mostly men, except for his wife, probably the first underwater explorer who was female. I mean, once they got down there at depths, they could see these amazing creatures, these gigantic tuna fish, these huge octopuses. And so that's what triggered the filming gene for him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow, we're underwater. We've got to make movies about this because this is mesmerizing, which it was. And today you could put your watch in the water and make an underwater movie. At the time, there was no lighting, there was no film, there were no cameras that didn't. Imagine developing a waterproof camera. So he went from, engineering to curiosity to engineering to filmmaking. And that opened up his eyes to the back to the book, my book, Preciousness, and to the Earth Day. Preciousness, these things are unique. Who could imagine them? And so he went on to become a television icon, as you referenced, because television was a new medium. I mean, this is before my time, but with him. But television needed content.
Yes.
And so they were looking for exciting new things to put on television. So he came along just at the moment when, there was a new medium needing new material, and he had, irresistible material. So that's what made him. And it's true that on any given night, and this is very important for today's world that's so fragmented and informationally disjointed, 200 million people were watching the very same Jacques Cousteau special. 200 million people saw the very same thing at the same time, more or less, as it moved around the world. And this transformed a universe of audience, not just a handful of people, a universe of people who experienced the underwater world for the first time, might have been right off of their coast. They were attracted to it. And his thing was people protect what they love. And his whole thing was, how can I get people to fall in love with the ocean? And that's what he accomplished. And it's still very much there today. And I must say, I was just watching something the other night, and, all it focused on was predation. How these big birds are murderers and thugs. It's thuggish. Imagine calling a bald eagle a thug. I mean, just incredible emphasis on the cruelty and violence that's part of the law of the jungle, which we never did. I mean, we did a little of that, but the whole idea was to emphasize the diversity of the world and the importance of that diversity and all of these beautiful things that are part of nature. So what I did for him, so how did I even get hooked up with him? Because I was still not interested particularly in anything to do with the environment. But what I was interested in was adding material that I could write about. And I was freelancing. And at that time, you could freelance and get paid. I know you can freelance today, but not get paid. You can do anything today if you want to not get paid. Publish a book, don't get paid. If you don't want to get paid, the world is your oyster. But if you want to get paid, it's not such an oyster. And at the time, you could call an editor and suggest a story and kick it around. You can't do that today. And so I wanted to be able to call editors and say, well, I now know a little more about science. I know a little bit about the oceans. So I volunteered to work for Cousteau. And that next day, I got a call from an editor there who offered me a full-time job working on a book called the Cousteau Almanac, because he saw that I had a publishing record and they needed people. And so at first I didn't want to take it because I was enjoying my freelance life. But then I thought, well, it won't hurt to have a regular paycheck. And this guy Cousteau is famous, so you might meet him and all of that. Anyway, I volunteered and it changed my life. I ended up working there for something like 20 years. And I worked on the book. I edited many of the articles. I wrote about 150 myself. foreseeing that book, the Cousteau Almanac, really predicted almost everything that we're living through now through shorts. Talk about short read. We had these two, very short bits. Anyway, not to belabor it, but I ended up becoming a researcher for the films, and then an advanced person, where my main job was make sure we don't miss the big. If the coral's going to, coral reef is going to have its rebirth on June 15th at midnight, we got to be there. We can't be there on June 25th.
That's right.
So that was my job, and then I began writing the films, and all during this time, my career is going up. The quality of the earth is going down. More pollution, more of everything bad. And so the more I became involved and the higher I became involved and the more detailed it correlated with the deterioration of the Earth's systems. And Cousteau, too, began to realize that just making films was not enough. So he became very involved in policy. And one thing interesting potentially regarding leadership, he had access to just about anybody in the world. There was no one who wouldn't take his call. President, head of a company, anybody, they were all dying to meet him. He couldn't walk down the street. That's how popular and recognizable he was. So he had access to anybody, but he didn't have the slightest bit of patience for process and implementation. He felt he went into the White House, told the president something, and it would happen. And, I would say, don't think it's going to happen, because everybody is in there to tell the president that it shouldn't happen, or that, he can't make it happen. Only you could make it happen. So my job was to make stuff happen. So he kicked the door open, and I ended up becoming the vice president for international affairs, helping him implement his policy ideas.
So you were Cousteau's servant leader in action. Amazing.
I was definitely the servant. I don't know about the leader, but yeah, no, he was a great partner. It was a really, peer relationship. We respected each other, and he never touched my writing. If it says by Paula DiPerna, I wrote it. And if it says by Jacques Cousteau, he wrote it. We maybe give each other a little tip or two, but he did admire, I did really appreciate that I could get stuff done.
Well, an amazing part of your journey. And I love it when you remind me about his quote that people protect what they love. And clearly Cousteau embodied the principles of conceptualization and foresight with respect to environmental stewardship. I want to shift to something that you don't like to boast about. So it's my opportunity to let people know that you also had an amazing stint with the Chicago Climate Exchange, and as the president of CCE, your leadership enabled the organization to operate the world's first cap and trade system to address climate change. And without getting too much into heavy jargon, if you could help our audience to understand why that's such a big deal, including a little bit of an explanation about just what in the world is cap and trade.
Right. So if you look up, no matter where you're sitting or standing, 60 miles up, that's the extent of the atmosphere. That's the only thing keeping us from burning up. The role of the atmosphere is to protect us from solar heat. And if you think about it, it's one of the astronauts apparently said it's in the same relationship to the Earth as the peach fuzz is to the peach. And if you go like this on your face, you're going to find a few hairs, and it's in that same relationship. So we have this incredible, what I call in the book, cosmic penthouse. Now, what have we done for the last 100 years? We have taken our dirty diapers, which is essentially our pollution, our greenhouse gases, many of which have been burned for progress. Let's not forget that carbon itself and carbon dioxide is not per se a pollutant like arsenic. It's a byproduct of industrial development. But for the last 100 years, we've basically been putting in that cosmic penthouse the equivalent of dirty diapers for free, and using up this cosmic penthouse to store pollution. Now, what does that mean? It means that we have taken it for granted, that we may not have understood how thin and how precious that atmosphere was. We certainly didn't fully understand how global warming would work. So, the atmosphere can only do what it can do. it blocks the sun, but it can't block the sun if the gases, these heat trapping gases, greenhouse gases, which are the byproducts of burning fossil fuels, start filling up that cushion. So the heat is trapped in it. The heat can't be reflected. So cap and trade recognizes this 60 miles basically as a piece of real estate.
Huh.
Now, this is where it gets into, moral compass issues. But if you basically think of it as very scarce real estate, the cost of using it, of habitating it, of occupying it, of dumping in it, whatever you want to use as a verb, shouldn't be zero. And it has been. So what the cap and trade says is it's not zero. This is a scarce resource. And by the way, it's even more scarce now because, say, 3/4 of it's already soaked up all this pollution. There's only this much left. Out of this much, there's only super little left to absorb more pollution. So we better make it very expensive to store that remaining pollution. So a cap and trade basically sets a carbon diet based on the available space in the atmosphere, which is scientifically calculated. And then, like in a deal of cards, you get 52 cards in a deck. The authority, in most cases the government, issues these cards to polluters and says, okay, we understand you can't stop polluting tomorrow, but you're going to have to stop by X date. And between now and then, you got 10 cards. Each card's worth a ton. And that's all you have. You can only spend 10 tons. If you go over that, you got to buy from somebody else who didn't use up their 10. So it's a back and forth of trading between the people who can reduce emissions quickly and the people who can't, for many reasons, not least of which is, not wanting to. But most of the time now, the reason reductions don't occur quickly is because we've eaten the low-hanging fruit. It's difficult now to capture a lot more reduction. So for the last 100 years, we've been putting this stuff up in the atmosphere. And for the next 100, we're going to, stuff that was underground, that we dug out, we burned, and we put the emissions in the atmosphere. For the next 100 years, we're going to do the opposite, take it out of the atmosphere and try to figure out how to put it back. That is the absurdity of our situation. So a cap and trade is a tool to accelerate that and make sure we're on a carbon diet that is collective among us. That isn't just, the burden is not just being borne by one country or one nation or one set of people.
Two quick follow-up questions about the cap and trade process or market, if you will. Who regulates that, and how many entities and or countries are actually participating in this process?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So technically, nobody owns the atmosphere, right? Nobody's authorized to print the cards or anything. But the closest you can get to that is a government. So the United States basically invented cap and trade a long time ago to control one gas, sulfur dioxide, for acid rain. Important to understand that sulfur dioxide goes up and then falls right down almost next to, where it goes up, or mercury even more so. So sulfur dioxide was going up in the Midwest and blowing over to the Northeast, causing acid rain. And so the cap and trade was invented by the EPA in the United States to address that one pollutant. Now, greenhouse gases are 6, so that's more complicated. But in 1997, the U.S. pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, and we never developed a national system, and the European Union did. So the European Union has the largest cap and trade. There's one in New York, in the Northeast region. I'm not sure if New Jersey is still a member. They were a founding member, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's another one in California. And what these three enterprises do is set the cap, the maximum amount of pollution. And then as that cap is made tighter and tighter, the space becomes more and more scarce. So you have a supply and demand. Oops, suddenly the space you can occupy is less. So occupying it should become more expensive. So those are the big three in our part of the world, well, in the world. And then you have China's coming online and various other countries, Chile. But we need a global one.
Absolutely.
And we don't have that yet. And that's a political problem. But if we had a global cap and trade, we'd be well ahead on the problem.
Let's turn now to something, if I can get it, there we go, to this wonderful 246-page read Pricing the Priceless, the financial transformation to value the planet, solve the climate crisis, and protect our most precious assets. We got to start by asking, because as the saying goes, what's in a name, Paula? If you could share with our audience what you and your editor were thinking about in this title. We get the part about the financial transformation, at least most of us, and why we should solve the climate crisis. But pricing the priceless, say more about that, please.
So I came up with that. I was happy to be a Bellagio Fellow, the program of the Rockefeller Foundation, and I got to spend a month at the Rockefeller Foundation location at Lake Como, where I began this book. And I came up with the title because one, like pricing the priceless, what is that called? Alliteration, P, but also the dichotomy. The whole thing is a paradox. And I thought, how can you capture this paradox in a minimum number of words? And then I was thinking, wow, this view here, Lake Como is beautiful and gorgeous even. And, pricing the priceless. How would you, how do you price this view? People come and they pay for a hotel. They come, they fly an airplane, which maybe they shouldn't anymore. But, is the value of this view what you're willing to pay to see it? Is the value of the view what everybody who's ever seen it has paid? Is the value what everybody who will ever see it has paid? And when you start trying to figure that out, you realize it's not something you'll ever be able to actually quantify. And so I thought Pricing the Priceless captured the paradox, and it was in part, very related to the place that I was in. And then, of course, the publisher, from a point of view of the editor, everyone is interested in climate change, so we need the word climate in there. And then I wanted to say, to protect what we most need and love most.
Huh.
And they change it to protect our most precious assets.
Huh.
But the key word is precious and assets in there. So, in writing, you have to give your editor something. So I gave in on that point, but they kept the Pricing the Priceless, so I was happy.
In having the privilege of knowing you, I sense that you didn't give in too much with respect to the 14 chapters. And without giving this away for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, I will say that my team and I plucked out 4 of the 14 to sort of do a deeper dive for our audience today. And we got to start with that enormous sense of agency on your part to write a letter to the Pope and eventually get an audience with him, and to help him to understand that perhaps he had some misguided thinking about market tools. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that, I can't really explain it, but, the thing that I tried to do in this book was simplify a field that has been growing in existence for, a number of decades, namely environmental economics, which more or less says that nothing is free, that earth services are not free, water filtration, pollination, all these things that we use and take up are not free. And even when we pay, you buy cotton or you buy oil or you buy anything, you're still paying a price lower than what the ultimate value is. And for most things, you're not paying any value. And so this has been or paying any price because you don't value it. What you get for free, think of an all-you-can-eat buffet. How many of us overeat at something like that? Imagine if the buffet was free. So, which is what nature is. So environmental economics is critical, but it's always stood outside of conventional economics, which is what I tried to remedy and what I think is still the problem. But I'm not an economist. I'm not a financier. Didn't go to business school. And if I felt it was essential to figure out a way to get this to the average person's thinking, financial thinking. Now, the Pope became quite involved in climate change, and he condemned cap and trade in carbon markets in a very important document that he issued in 2015, you've all probably heard of the Paris Agreement. So all these countries were coming to Paris to try to really grip the climate problem and get some action. And I think 120, 30 countries were coming, and about 60% of them had included in their action plan a plan to use a cap and trade or a carbon market. But they were all fragmented. As I said earlier, we need a global system. So just when people were thinking about how can we knit all these things together, the Pope comes out and condemns them. And I read this document and I thought, well, that is really so oversimplified and comes from what I figured was the Pope's moral indignation that you could put a price on things like the atmosphere. And that everything was above price. And so I wrote to the ambassador from the Vatican to the UN and said, I think this document is going to be counterproductive, and here's why. And again, people answer you on the phone. Nobody answers you now, so none of this could happen. I mean, nobody would never have taken my calls. So think about that, everybody, when you don't take calls. If you only take the calls from people like you get unknown on your mobile and you think, I'm not answering, could be me. It could be the Pope, But anyway, he called back and we chatted and he said, send me some notes. So I sent him some notes. He said, I think this should reach the Pope. And I said, good. Well, how do you think we're going to reach the Pope? He said, you write a letter to the Pope, and I'll get it in the pouch, the diplomatic pouch, and get it to Rome. And so that's what happened. And then it went to one of the cardinals, Cardinal Turkson, who is from Ghana, and a leader in the church, and was then the Pope's right-hand man on climate change. And so he wrote me back, and then I called him, and then I went to meet with him, and I convinced him. And he said, well, the Pope can't take back what he said. And I said, well, he doesn't have to take it back. He just has to say something in addition. And so Cardinal takes Turk. I said, you have a newspaper. You have you have a papal newspaper. Why don't you could just put an op-ed that says cap and trade has some good things. So he said, write what you want to read. So I sent him an outline of what eventually could have been an op-ed. They never did that, but they did invite me to the Vatican for 2 conferences, which included audiences with the Pope. But in the meantime, other people had gotten the idea of, trying to convince the Pope that market mechanisms and pricing were not, anathema to his principles. And eventually he did embrace the pricing of carbon. And eventually through me, I can't take full credit for carbon pricing, but I can for Carbon Neutral Vatican. So on the second audience, I was able to convince the Vatican to undertake that, which is a whole separate topic. But I think the main thing that I got out of meeting the Pope, apart from being it's a mesmerizing experience. And to be in the inner sanctum of the inner sanctum, the private papal apartments where the door flies open and the Pope walks in, these gigantic doors, and Michelangelo on the other side of the wall, the Sistine Chapel. It's just beyond immediate comprehension. And sitting there seeing people from all over the world go up, embrace the Pope, come back crying just from being in the room. And what I realized was, it took me a couple of years to get all this going. And the actual audience was over in a very few minutes. By the time they convened us in the hall outside, and then we walked through the apartments and then up the Bernini staircase and then into the Salia Regia and then the chat with the Pope, and then you sit down. It was over in a very few minutes relative to the time I took to get there. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's what this is all about. It took centuries, eons, millennia for the Earth to evolve into all these magnificent systems. And in a flash, we've eaten it up.
Wow. In a flash.
In a relative flash. And it's almost in the same relationship. And I remember thinking, Paula, you did not appreciate, as much as I appreciated that visit, I kept saying to myself, Paula, you did not appreciate it enough. This was not only a once in a lifetime, but think of who you're representing, all the people who would never do this, And so it just was a reminder to not take certain things for granted.
Absolutely. And thank God for your letter. My team is reminding me that we're down to really just time for one more question. And so I want to talk about, particularly in chapter 6, where you remind us of the impressive history of the significant range of international convenings and conferences on climate change, beginning in 1992 with the Earth Summit in Rio, and the follow-up convenings known as the Conference of Parties, COP21, COP28. Gabby, pull up that particular quote we want to share with our audience.
Okay, so our quote reads, "Since basic recognition of the climate change problem surfaced, if we total the person-hours of time spent in conferences, debates, panels, workshops, brainstorming sessions, blogs, tweets, podcasts, webinars, research, commentary, analysis, synthesis, speculation, presentation, opining, and exhorting, in person and countless more on Zoom, we could find that we have spent perhaps hour for hour more time discussing the climate change problem, and yet have to face the fact that we are still very behind on solving it."
Why so many missed opportunities, Paula?
Because it's a hard problem. And we turned it, in 1992, it was a linear problem. Emissions go up, we got to have them come down. We didn't act quick enough when it was a linear problem. We kept kicking the can. And every year that we kicked the can, it became more like spaghetti and meatballs, the problem. So today you can't really isolate one element of the problem easily. So for example, we want to have, hybrids and electric cars. We haven't built the chargers. We want to mine the deep sea, tear up the bottom of the ocean to get manganese nodules that have materials that are essential to batteries, but we have no mechanism for deciding what we're going to use the batteries for. We don't have any international adjudication over how to use resources so that we don't spoil them over here and the people over there can't use them. And also everybody wants a silver bullet, and we have a lot of different opinions on we can go 100% renewable. Some people say, other people say we can't, that you always need a backup. So we've created a world of trade-offs, and we don't, I think, ultimately, to answer directly the question, even the UN, and we see this with War and Peace, we don't have an international body that can arbitrate among countries with justice, with fairness, and with scientific rigor to say, ultimately, everyone has to do this. Nobody can be commanded to do anything. And therefore, we don't do enough. And it's almost, it's exactly the model of a teacher-student, parent-child. How much do you let evolve? How much do you command? How much leadership versus how much fun? Everybody wants to be first in the climate change problem, when actually we need second, third, fourth movers who say, that's a great idea. Transportation on sea by ships, by sailing, we used to do it, right? Like 500 years ago. Why can't we return to that? So why isn't there a massive effort to perfect new ships, new sails for ships, instead of just a company here and a company there that's begging for funding?
Huh.
So, big ideas need big solutions, and we just never came to the scale. Now, that doesn't mean we can't solve it, but the window of time is running out. So the reason, and thank you for reading that quote, what I was saying is including me, I've talked for hundreds of hours on this thing, and, we just have to stop talking about it and just really just start commanding ourselves to recognize that space is very finite. And, the last line of my book is we need nature only if we need infinity.
Huh. Well,
So
of
that's
course,
the challenge.
That's the challenge. Big ideas need big solutions. And I think you've done more than talk, Paul. I think you've done
Mm.
a fair amount of acting. Uh, we want to open up to our audience who've uh, uh, some folk are texting me saying that I'm hogging up all the time with you, Paula. And Gabby, I'm going to turn it over to you now to walk us through the Q&A portion of the program.
Yes, thank you, Reggie. Okay, so we don't want to leave off on a sour note with that last question. So what gives you hope?
Hope. You guys, I mean, hope, you can't wait, why would you wake up in the morning if you didn't have it? I mean, I think hope, human beings, as much as we're capable of cruelty and violence, we're also capable of brilliance and innovation and excitement and love. And so you just have to hope that the good side of our economy and the good side of our nature will prevail. And so I believe that ultimately we can grip these big problems. I think where I have less hope is that we've lost faith in our institutions, and with good reason. But I hope that we can wake up and really call out bad things and call for good things.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is, what are ways in which everyday people can help to contribute to conserving our planet?
So I'm happy with that question because I think, first of all, think about your money.
Mm.
Don't think about recycling. Think about, how do you spend your money? Are you actually getting the value for what you're spending your money on? Is your money being used properly? Because if you don't understand what you're getting for your own money, how can you understand what we're getting, what the nature is giving us for free? So think about how you're spending. Are you spending your money wisely? Are you wasting money? Then, and understand, I think everybody should take a business course, certainly every college kid. I wish I had, because we can't let finance be this exclusive province of people who kind of tell us what's going on in the economy. You have to understand the economy, understand that it's subsidized by nature, and fight that with your purse, fight that with your behavior. And if you have a portfolio or any kind of savings, ask yourself, what's my bank doing? Even if you have $200 in the bank or 100, what is my bank doing? Do they what are they invested in green things? Or how are they making money? And shift away, in a sense. My recommendation: shifts a little away from your lifestyle change to your money change, because in the end, it's all about moving money from bad things to good things. And that's why I wrote the book. It's to transform the economy, to flip. And my question always has been, like, how can we value Uber, which I know everybody uses and loves, but what is it? It's a software program with a bunch of drivers who use their own cars and basically subsidize with their car the value of the company, and who don't get benefits, by the way, and basically just disrupt the taxi industry, which was already doing the same thing. It's just different cars. But that's all it is. And it's valued in the billions of dollars. Now, how can you value Uber, which is a convenience, you don't need it, in the billions of dollars, and the atmosphere at zero? And that's the dichotomy we have to solve. And until we can solve that, doesn't mean Uber has to go away. It just means the atmosphere can't be valued at zero. And the only way we're going to put a value on the atmosphere, in the sense of, once you value something, you protect it, it'll show up on the books of your town as an asset. If the forests are clean and the water is standing and the water is clean, and there's a bookkeeping evidence that the town is well managed, now the town has assets and can borrow against assets. It's not just a cost. Oh, keeping the forests, keeping the parks clean is a cost for us. No, keeping the parks clean is an asset for us. Very different if you understand bookkeeping, which I didn't understand until I wrote this book. But I recommend you all save yourself some headache and understand bookkeeping.
Well, thank you for that advice, because that's the advice that certainly for me, I haven't heard that often. So thank you. Our next question is, can you speak more about how the green economy and the economic benefits tie to environmental stewardship?
Yeah, because I think, again, recognizing the paradox that you can never put a real price on anything. You're not putting a value on something to say that's the top value. You're putting a value on the scarcity of it and the uniqueness of it. And so if the economy recognized the value of things that are free from nature, that would be essentially the greening of the economy. And if we had a valuation system that recognized the free subsidy that nature is providing, the economy would be entirely green. And, there are people who would say the GDP would be zero if nature didn't exist, which is true. When you really stop and think about it. Now, how do you operationalize that is in a bookkeeping sense. And there was a recent report from the UN of climate finance, and they calculated that 7% of the current GDP, which call that 7 trillion a year roughly, is nature negative, is exactly attacking, deteriorating nature, is working against nature. So that's a pretty high number of dollars. And, imagine if you could say that they were working for nature. So that's what I think the answer is there, is that we have to get economic recognition for nature services, put a value on them, charge properly for them, and I bet we start using them less.
Okay, so our next question is, are there any aspects of the book that have been taken up or pursued by policymakers?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the investment vehicles that I'm talking about have been, circulated. The Rhino bond, the forest resilience bonds, which we didn't get to talk about. I'm giving a keynote next week on it. World Bank, they've all invited me to come talk about it, so that, because I've been shocked at how little they seem to know about these innovations, the people who manage our money. And so policymakers, not necessarily, although I can't take credit for this, but I can take some credit. Even the United States government has now set up a new system of national accounts, which the Biden administration, this goes back to 20 years ago, where actually they were talking about national parks and public woods being assets to the country. So this green economy thing, a green accounting, is becoming more of a policy keystone, but it meets a lot of resistance because, one, we're used to another way of booking things, and two, there aren't enough people in the climate movement who understand money. And I think, therefore, money has gotten away with murder, almost, essentially, speaking about murder and cruelty, as I said earlier in the movie. I don't want to characterize the economy as a thug, but in a sense, it has become that. It's a predator, even though it gives us benefits. And that's where we have to come in and say, okay, how many benefits do I need for free, and how many am I willing to pay for? And that doesn't mean put a burden on the poor. There are ways to make sure that poor people are insulated from higher costs. If a gas price goes up, they don't have to pay it. You can means test it. That's not an excuse. We can protect the poor from the costs that are going to be inevitable if we really want to address environmental issues. Nobody's been willing to say that things will become more expensive, and they will. But that's okay, because most of us are wasting our money and our energy, and a lot of fat is in the system.
Thank you. Okay, so for our last question, we want to turn back to the book. In chapter 4, you discuss the fascinating story about the city of Detroit, where we learn about how the city's precious art housed in the Detroit Institute of Art gets saved from being gobbled up by creditors amidst the municipality's bankruptcy. So you help us to appreciate the fact that sometimes price and value cannot be easily assigned. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, that was a great case. So first of all, the leaders of Detroit at that time didn't understand finance, number one. So number one problem, didn't go to business school or learn. So city's on the verge of bankruptcy. Then capital markets people come in and sell them basically old fish. And they buy it and they say, okay, we'll pay you back, and we're going to pay you back whether interest rates go up or down. And the city gets crushed by the fact that it bought the wrong instruments, probably criminal behavior on the part of the people who sold them. But so now, what are they going to do? How are they going to pay off the creditors? What do we own? And so they look to the art collection, which in Detroit is priceless, and is all the major masterpieces, including the Diego Rivera murals, which are painted on the wall. And so the people in the city, oh my God, can we sell that? We need cash. And it was really like an idea of a fire sale. What can we get for this Van Gogh, this Matisse, this Cézanne, la, la, la. And then it was just one person who said, wait. I mean, we can't just start selling everything, and pulled together an opportunity to take the art off the table in return for a stipulated amount. But what amount? So they hired all these appraisers, and it was so obvious that even the Christie's and Sotheby's of the world could not finally put a price on this art collection because no one agreed. Cézanne's worth this. No, it's not. It's worth that. Then the Diego Rivera mural, the thing that really made the whole operation absurd was somebody said, well, the Diego Rivera murals, which we all know will never be painted again and are priceless art pieces, they're really the only value they have is the value of the cement on the wall, because we can't take them off the wall. So how could they be valuable if they got moved there? So if they got moved, they would be worth zero. And being on the wall, they're only worth the value of the real estate of the building. So you started to see how absurd it was. And yet everybody knew that the sum of this priceless resource would help the city get out of bankruptcy. So it was a very creative move by a judge who pulled philanthropists and others together and said, let's say we're never going to sell this art. What will you put up for that promise? And so everybody who had some money kicked in, and they eventually came up with a sum that didn't negate the debt of the city, but enabled the city to pay off the creditors, protect the pensioners whose pensions would have been zero. So everybody had to do what is called take a haircut. So instead of getting, X percentage of their lifetime work, they got a smaller percentage. The banks got a smaller percentage of their debt. Everybody took less, but it was better than zero. So this art collection proved that you just have to deal with the ambiguity. You have to accept that something is priceless and know that it has value, even if you can't put all the zeros there with certainty. And that's why it's so philosophical, and back to servant leadership and back to foresight and the values of the Greenleaf Center. This is an internal process. This is a philosophical process. It's about balancing trade-offs for the greater good. And so that's what they did in Detroit, but it was the art collection that was the trigger there.
Yeah, wow, what a fascinating story that is, and
Fascinating.
helps us to realize the price we put on our planet. We want to thank you so much, Paula, for taking the time to be here with us today. I'm going to have some quick announcements before we log off. So starting with our Greenleaf Scholars application portal is now open for researchers promoting the efficacy and impact of servant leadership. Applications are due on May 1st at 12 p.m. For more information on how to apply, you can visit greenleaf.org. Next, we have our Hall of Fame nominations are open as well. For information on how to nominate and the nomination criteria, you can visit greenleaf.org, where that information is linked to our homepage. Nominations are due on May 15th at 12 p.m. And lastly, we'd like to invite you to next month's webinar with Joe Patterncheck, who will be joining us to discuss his experience using servant leadership to transform the workplace culture and patient experience at the Cleveland Clinic. You can use the QR code on the screen here to register, or visit our website where registration is linked to the homepage. And if you would like to stay connected with the Greenleaf Center, you could use the QR codes here on the screen to follow what we have to offer. And lastly, I want to thank everybody who logged on today to take part in our webinar. If you could please take the Zoom survey that will pop up after this webinar concludes, we would greatly appreciate it. And again, thank you so much, Paula, for taking your time to be here with us today on Earth Day.
Thank you so much, Paula, for all you do and for the gift of Pricing the Priceless. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining and for hosting. Take care now. Enjoy your day.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.